Summer, 1943. Camp Alva, northwestern Oklahoma. A transport convoy carrying newly processed German prisoners of war rolled through the gates as the evening meal preparation was already underway in the camp's mess facilities. The men climbing down from the trucks were veterans of North Africa, of the Eastern Front, of campaigns in France, and the Low Countries that had swept British, Soviet, and French armies before them. They had survived conditions that had broken entire armies. They had crossed burning desert with inadequate water and fought through Russian winters in equipment designed for a different continent. They were not soft men. They were not easily impressed. They had also been briefed. German military doctrine held that prisoners of war should resist psychological pressure from their captors, that American captors would use comfort and manipulation in place of the direct interrogation methods German training had prepared them for. Their officers had told them before departure, "The food will seem good at first. The treatment will seem reasonable. This is designed to make you compliant, to make you talk, to make you forget your duty. Stay German, stay hard, remember who you are." The men who climbed off those trucks in Oklahoma carried those instructions in their heads. They also carried, after months or years of active service, the accumulated physical reality of wartime German rations. They were thin in the specific way of men who have been systematically underfed for long enough that their bodies have reorganized around scarcity. Their uniforms hung differently than they had at the beginning of the war. Their relationship with food had become, over months and years of campaign, something they thought about constantly and had learned not to show that they thought about. Then a stocky Feldwebel, a veteran sergeant who had served in Rommel's Afrika Korps, and whose unit's surrender at Kasserine had sent him through processing facilities in Tunisia, a troop ship across the Atlantic, and now this Oklahoma dust pointed at the large metal trays being carried toward the mess area. His face moved through a sequence: wariness, disbelief, then something settling into contempt. He turned to the man beside him. "Das ist Tierfutter," he said. "That is animal feed." He was pointing at sweet corn. Ears of it, dozens of them, golden and steaming in the early evening light, piled on trays headed for human beings. In Germany, in all of Central Europe, corn was maize. Maize was what you fed to pigs and cattle when you wanted them to put on weight before slaughter. You grew it in fields because it was efficient, because a given area of land produced more feed value in maize than in almost anything else. This was precisely why you grew it. Not for people, but for animals who needed bulk, who converted plant matter into meat that then fed people. The chain from corn to human consumption required an animal in the middle. Eating corn directly, holding the cob with your hands, chewing from it like the livestock it was intended for, was, to a German soldier of 1943, either profound poverty or the fundamental misunderstanding of agriculture. These Americans, the Feldwebel concluded, were barbarians who did not know what food was. What he did not know, what none of the men stepping off those trucks understood, was that within 30 days, most of them would be eating more calories per day than they had seen at any point in the previous 2 years of active service. That the animal food he was dismissing with contempt would become, within weeks, something he would request specifically. That the United States government would house, feed, and clothe nearly 400,000 of his fellow soldiers to standards that the German military had not consistently provided its own men since the early campaigns of the war. And that the America he had been told to expect, soft, materialistic, too comfortable to fight a real war, would turn out to be something his briefing officers had not adequately prepared him to confront. This is the story of what happened when the German army met American abundance, and how that meeting changed 400,000 minds. To understand what the corn encounter actually meant, you have to start with what Germans ate. Not what German soldiers ate, though that matters, what Germans ate as a culture, as a civilization, as people whose entire relationship with food had been shaped by geography, climate, and centuries of agricultural tradition. Germany is a country where the growing season is short and the soil in many regions is cold and heavy. German cuisine evolved around what German soil could reliably produce and what German winters required of the people who lived through them. Bread, dark and dense, made from rye that grew where wheat could not. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets, potatoes, that could be stored through winter without refrigeration. Pork, because pigs converted waste and root crops into protein more efficiently than cattle in German conditions. Sauerkraut, because fermentation was how Germans preserved the cabbage harvest through months when nothing fresh grew. This was not poverty food. It was intelligent food, developed by a culture that understood its environment and had organized its cuisine around sustainability and winter survival. A traditional German meal was hearty, calorie-dense, designed to sustain people doing heavy physical labor in cold conditions. The German relationship with food was serious and considered. Into this culinary framework, corn did not fit. Corn required heat, sustained warmth, a growing season longer than most of Germany could provide reliably. More importantly, corn produced in the quantities that made it economically meaningful grew in the kind of agricultural landscape that Germany simply did not have. When corn appeared in German agriculture at all, it was grown as Silage, silage corn, chopped green and stored for cattle feed. The question of whether humans might eat it directly never seriously arose, because no human would choose maize over the real food that German agriculture was organized around producing. This was not prejudice. It was, from the German cultural perspective, simply accurate assessment. Corn was a crop of poverty and livestock, and the Americas, whatever else they were, had apparently never developed a cuisine sophisticated enough to use their agricultural products properly. What German culture had not accounted for was sweet corn, the American development that had, over generations, produced varieties of corn specifically optimized for human consumption, harvested at a moment of sweetness before the sugars converted to starch, served fresh in ways that bore essentially no resemblance to the dried field corn or silage corn that Germans knew. American sweet corn, eaten within hours of picking at the height of summer, was a different product in almost every meaningful way. The German soldiers at Camp Alva did not know this. They saw corn and understood it as maize, and their conclusion followed automatically from their understanding. By the summer of 1943, German soldiers had been living with wartime rationing for nearly 4 years. The early campaigns had been well supplied. France had been stripped of its own considerable food resources, and German troops moving through Western Europe in 1940 and 1941 had eaten reasonably well by any wartime standard. But the Eastern Front had changed everything. The scale of the campaign, the distances involved, the catastrophic logistical demands of fighting in a country the size of Russia, all of it had begun grinding down the German supply system in ways that showed first in the food. By the summer of 1943, soldiers in North Africa had been operating at significantly below standard ration levels for weeks at a time. The Mediterranean supply route was interdicted by British air and naval power to a degree that meant German and Italian troops in Tunisia received, in the final months of the campaign, perhaps 60 to 70% of their nominal ration allocation. They were not starving, but they were hungry in the persistent, grinding way that wartime underfeeding creates, never quite enough, always calculating, always aware of what had been and was no longer. These men arrived in Oklahoma, in Texas, in Wisconsin, in Maryland, carrying that hunger and those calculations. They stepped off the trucks, expecting American captivity to be, at best, a managed continuation of their existing conditions. Their officers had prepared them for psychological pressure. They had not prepared them, because no one had adequately prepared anyone for the reality they were about to encounter. The American prisoner of war system was operated by the Provost Marshal General's office and had been built around a single, non-negotiable legal foundation. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had signed, required that prisoners of war receive the same rations as the detaining power's own soldiers. The United States military interpreted this requirement literally and applied it comprehensively. German prisoners would receive what American soldiers received. What American soldiers received was approximately 3,800 calories per day, substantially more than the wartime rations of any other major belligerent. America fed its soldiers well because it could afford to feed its soldiers well, because American agricultural production was so vast and so efficiently organized that even with millions of men under arms and lend-lease shipments going to Britain and the Soviet Union, there remained enough to feed American troops at a standard that European soldiers on either side would have recognized as extraordinary. German prisoners would receive the same. This decision was made partly from genuine humanitarian conviction. American military leaders believed in the Geneva Convention as a protection that ran in both directions, and American prisoners in German custody were already a concern. It was made partly from practical strategic calculation. Prisoners who were healthy and reasonably content were less trouble to manage than prisoners who were sick and resentful. And it was made partly from something harder to quantify, a national instinct that how America treated its prisoners said something about what America was, and that what America was mattered not just to the prisoners, but to the watching world. The camps themselves were distributed across the country, over 500 facilities in 45 states by the war's peak. Camp Alva in Oklahoma, Camp Mexia in Texas, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Fort Meade in Maryland, Fort Robinson in Nebraska. Each of these facilities received prisoners who had been processed at East Coast ports, stripped of military equipment and documentation, given American-issue clothing, and transported inland to begin a captivity that would last, for most of them, until late 1945 or early 1946. German officers within the prisoner population maintained military authority over their men, as the Geneva Convention permitted. These officers had received intelligence briefings about American psychological operations before departure from German territory, and they continued issuing guidance to their men throughout captivity. The guidance was consistent. The American treatment is a manipulation. The good food is designed to make you compliant. The comfortable conditions are intended to erode your will to resist. Stay German. What the officers could not say, because there was no counter-briefing that adequately addressed it, was what to do when you discovered that the manipulation, if that is what it was, included strawberry ice cream and fresh sweet corn and white bread made from refined flour and meat, served as a main course rather than a supplement. Enemy accounts from this period, filtered through the post-war memoirs and oral histories collected by researchers in both Germany and the United States, reveal a consistent pattern in how German prisoners processed the initial encounter with American camp food. The first response, almost universally, was suspicion. This was part of the psychological preparation they had received. The second response, occurring within days rather than weeks, was a kind of cognitive dissonance, the need to maintain the intellectual position that American food was a manipulation, while their bodies were experiencing it as simply food, good food, more food than they had eaten in years. The third response, slower and more private, was a recalibration that most prisoners would not have been willing to name at the time. The mess hall at Camp Alva operated on a schedule that American military regulations specified and that German prisoners found, in the first week, nearly impossible to fully believe. Breakfast included eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitute that had become standard in German military, feeding, bread, butter, preserves, coffee, and fruit juice when available. The quantities were, by the standards of a German soldier who had been operating on field rations, extravagant to the point of provocation. Lunch was the largest meal, and it was here that the corn appeared in its fullest form. Not just corn, meat, vegetables, bread, potatoes, soup, but corn as a featured element of the meal, treated by the American camp staff who prepared it as though it were an ordinary and desirable food rather than livestock supplementation. The mess staff were accustomed to the reaction from new German arrivals and had learned to simply continue their work while the new men adjusted. The adjustment, in terms of the specific corn question, followed a pattern. In the first days, prisoners who had publicly committed to the animal feed position maintained it through the mechanism of social accountability. Having said the thing, they were obligated to stand by it, at least where others could see. They ate around the corn. They left it on their trays. They made the comments they had already made, elaborated them, performed the contempt that their initial assessment had produced. Then they watched their comrades. Not the Americans. The Americans were an unknown quantity, barbarians who ate animal food, which proved nothing but their fellow German soldiers. Men who had served in the same units, who had fought in the same conditions, who were not soft or gullible or susceptible to propaganda. These men ate the corn. And when these men ate the corn, they showed no sign of degradation, no descent into animal nature, no confirmation that consuming mice was incompatible with German military identity. The second week, the corn question became less a matter of principle and more a matter of calories. Men who had been operating on reduced rations for months found that leaving food on their trays, when that food was plentiful and free and available, was a practice their bodies refused to sustain indefinitely. The intellectual position was real. The hunger was also real. The hunger had been real longer. By the third week in camp, most of the men who had arrived declaring the corn inedible were eating it without comment. A small number, primarily those whose sense of cultural identity was most tightly wound around the distinction between German and American, German and primitive, held out longer. But the holding out was private by then. It was one thing to publicly declare animal food inedible. It was another to maintain that declaration, loudly, while standing in a line that was moving efficiently toward a tray of food that smelled considerably better than anything you had eaten in the past 8 months. The corn was sweet. This was the fact that no ideological position had prepared them for. Dried field corn was starchy and bland. Silage corn was bitter and rough. American sweet corn, at the peak of the summer harvest in Oklahoma, was genuinely and unmistakably sweet, not in the way of sugar, but in the way of something harvested at exactly the right moment, something in which the plant's entire summer of effort had concentrated itself into a form that the human palate recognized, across all cultural conditioning, as good. Post-war accounts from German prisoners consistently describe the first voluntary bite of corn with the specific quality of experiences that change something, not dramatically, not in the way of conversion or revelation, but in the quiet, persistent way that genuine sensory experience defeats intellectual positions, the way that encountering something that is actually good, rather than theoretically acceptable or culturally approved, rearranges your categories without making an argument. The agricultural work details sent German prisoners into the landscape of American farming at scale, and scale was the element of American agriculture that proved to be, in retrospect, as effective as any deliberate reorientation program. German prisoners assigned to farm labor worked in the Central Valley of California, the cotton and corn regions of the Mississippi Delta, the wheat belts of Kansas and Oklahoma, the tobacco fields of Virginia and North Carolina, the fruit orchards of Washington state. They went where American agricultural labor was short, because American men were overseas fighting the war, and they arrived in farming environments that had no European equivalent. A German farmer of the 1940s managed his land in units of hectares. He knew his fields by name or family story. He knew exactly how many rows of each crop he was growing, because he had planted them himself or his father had. The relationship between a German farmer and his land was intimate, specific, and small-scale by American standards. German prisoners working American agricultural labor details encountered farms measured in thousands of acres. They encountered fields that extended past the visible horizon, planted in single crops that stretched in every direction without interruption. They encountered machinery, mechanical corn pickers, tractors with multiple row planting implements, irrigation systems that covered hundreds of acres at once, that moved through fields at speeds and in quantities that their frame of reference had no category for. A prisoner from an agricultural region of Bavaria who worked on a corn detail in Illinois described, in an account collected years later, the specific moment when he understood something about the war that no amount of battlefield experience had made clear to him. He was working alongside an American mechanical corn picker, a device that moved through rows of corn, stripping the ears from the stalks faster than he could track individually. He stood watching the ears tumble into the collection wagon and found himself doing arithmetic he could not stop. This one field, this one day, this one machine. The quantity of corn being harvested in the hours he had been standing there exceeded, by his calculation, the corn that his entire village in Bavaria would grow in a year. And he was looking at one field among hundreds he could see from where he stood, in one county among hundreds in the state of Illinois, in one state among dozens that produced corn at this scale. He did not need anyone to explain to him what he was seeing. He had spent years fighting a war that Germany was supposed to win because of German industrial and military efficiency. He was watching a country harvest animal food so common, so abundant, that they gave it to prisoners, with machines that his country's industry could not have produced in the quantities he was observing, even if it had given up producing weapons entirely. The implications arrived not as an argument, but as a physical sensation, a weight in the chest, a stillness. The kind of quiet that comes over a man who has just understood something he cannot put back into the box it came from. He told no one. At the time. He ate his corn that evening without comment. The ice cream appeared at Camp Alva on the 4th of July, 1944. American Independence Day was not a holiday that camp administration was required to observe. They chose to. The choice was partly tradition. American camp staff celebrated their national holiday regardless, and partly the deliberate extension of that celebration into the prisoner population in ways that required no explanation and could not easily be objected to. You could tell a German prisoner he was being manipulated by democracy. You could not easily prevent him from experiencing strawberry ice cream. Ice cream was not rationed in America. It was not unavailable. It was something that American children ate in summer, and American adults associated with the ease and comfort of peacetime normalcy. For American camp staff, offering ice cream on a holiday was an ordinary act, the extension of normalcy into an extraordinary situation, a small gesture of civilian life maintained despite wartime. For German prisoners of war in the summer of 1944, ice cream was not ordinary. Ice cream in Germany required sugar, dairy, fat, refrigeration, and distribution infrastructure that had been systematically stripped by wartime necessity. By 1944, ice cream in Germany was a memory, something from the years before the war, something that children asked about and adults quietly missed. German civilians in 1944 were managing on a daily ration that historians have estimated at approximately 1,800 calories, a level that precluded sweetness as anything other than a remembered luxury. German prisoners at Camp Alva were receiving nearly twice that daily ration, and now, on an American holiday they did not observe, they were being handed cardboard cups of strawberry ice cream by camp workers who were treating the distribution as routine. Post-war accounts from prisoners who were present at similar camp celebrations describe reactions that the participants themselves found difficult to articulate clearly decades later. Not joy, that is the wrong word. Not gratitude, exactly. Gratitude implies a relationship between giver and receiver that the prisoners were not prepared to acknowledge, something closer to bewilderment. The specific bewilderment of encountering a reality so distant from what you had been told to expect that your prepared responses have no application. A German officer whose memoir included an account of his first encounter with American ice cream wrote, years after the war, that the experience had forced on him a question he had not been equipped to ask. What kind of country provides ice cream to its enemy's soldiers in the middle of a total war? And what does the answer to that question mean for the war itself? He could not have written that in a letter home. He knew it would not pass the censor. He held the cardboard cup in the July heat and thought about it instead. He ate the ice cream. Then he thought about it some more. By the winter of 1944, the prisoner population across American camps was receiving, through censored correspondence, information from home that told them things the words themselves could not say. German civilian rations had been reduced. The fighting in France and the rapidly collapsing Eastern Front was consuming German manpower and material at rates that no propaganda system could adequately obscure. The letters from home were careful, as German letters had learned to be, careful in the way that people who live under censorship become instinctively careful, saying permitted things in ways that communicate the unpermitted ones to people who know how to read them. We are managing, the letters said. We are not suffering, the letters said. Things are difficult, but we remain strong. German prisoners who had been in American custody for more than 6 months read these letters with an understanding of what they meant that their camp officers could not prevent. They were eating 3,800 calories per day. Their families were eating 1,800. They were warm, housed, paid for their labor, and provided with libraries and sports and theatrical productions organized by fellow prisoners. Their families were cold, rationing fuel, working in factories being bombed by Allied air forces that had grown to a scale that German intelligence had not predicted, and German air defenses could not stop. The internal accounting that prisoners did with this information was private. It was not shared in letters home. American censors were thorough, and even the encoding systems that prisoners developed to communicate through apparently innocent language were regularly identified and adapted to. It was not shared openly with fellow prisoners, because the German officer corps within the camps maintained discipline and ideological pressure that made open expression of defeatist reasoning dangerous. But the thinking happened. In bunk rooms at night, in work details where prisoners had moments away from supervision, in the specific privacy of the human mind when it is not being watched. German prisoners in American camps were, by the winter of 1944, performing a calculation that they had not intended to perform and could not stop once it had started. The calculation was not sophisticated. It required only the arithmetic of comparison. What they had, what Germany had, what America could apparently produce, not just in weapons. They knew about weapons. They had experienced American firepower in the field, but in everything, in the everyday material of life. In the calories of a prisoner of war, in the strawberry ice cream served on a summer holiday, in the sweet corn that grew in fields without visible edges across the American interior. The intellectual diversion program, developed by American authorities in response to the political reality of the prisoner population, recognized explicitly what the food was already accomplishing. German prisoners who had experienced American democracy as a daily material reality were more receptive to its values than prisoners who received those values as lectures. The program provided democratic education, access to non-Nazi German literature and journalism, organized discussion groups, and access to American media. The program's administrators noted in their internal reports that the most effective element of the reorientation effort was not the classes or the discussions or the media access, it was the food. The simple, daily, irreducible physical reality of being well fed while fighting a war that was taking everything from the country that had sent you to fight it. German camp commanders who recognized this dynamic issued standing orders against what they called Amerikanisierung, Americanization, the process by which their men were losing political and cultural identity through the accumulation of material experience. The orders were enforced through social pressure, through the authority that military hierarchy maintains even in captivity, through the implicit and sometimes explicit threat of consequences for men who seemed too comfortable, too cooperative, too well-adjusted. The orders had diminishing returns. You could order a man not to enjoy his food. You could not make him not enjoy it. You could order a man to maintain contempt for American material culture. You could not make him maintain it while eating American food 3 times a day in quantities that exceeded what his country was providing to free civilians. The gap between the order and the reality was wide enough that men crossed it constantly, in small ways, in private, in the accumulating weight of daily experience that ideology could not outrun. The numbers tell a story that the individual accounts confirm and amplify. By the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945, the United States had held approximately 375,000 German prisoners in camps on American soil. They had been fed, housed, clothed, and paid at a cost that American taxpayers bore without significant political controversy, partly because prisoner labor was largely self-funding through agricultural and industrial work. The Afrika Korps, who had pointed at the corn trays on that first evening and declared them animal feed, held out, by his own accounting, for 11 days. 11 days of watching his comrades eat corn without dying, without becoming something other than German soldiers, without confirming in any observable way the theoretical degradation that eating livestock feed implied. 11 days of eating around the corn on his tray, of performing the contempt that his initial public declaration had committed him to, of maintaining an intellectual position against the evidence of his own hunger. On the 12th day, he ate it. He did not announce that he was eating it. He simply picked up the ear of corn and ate it, the way a man eats something when he has decided to stop making arguments and start eating. The first bite was the end of the argument, not because it changed his politics or his culture or his belief in German identity or his assessment of American civilization or his certainty that the war should have gone differently, but because it tasted like something. It tasted like sweetness. It tasted, in the specific sensory language of a man who had been hungry for a long time, like enough. He wrote to his wife that evening. He told her, carefully, because he knew the letter would be censored on both ends, that the camp was providing corn to eat, and that the corn was meant for people rather than animals, and that the Americans were the sort of people who ate it this way and found it perfectly ordinary. His wife wrote back to say she didn't understand what he meant. He said he had not known how to explain it in a letter, which was why he was explaining it, 20 years later, to the researcher who had come to interview him about his wartime experience. The researcher had asked a simple question at the beginning of the interview. What do you remember most about your time as a prisoner? He had not hesitated. He had not offered a list. He had not considered multiple candidates and weighed them against each other. The answer had been there immediately, in the way that answers are when the question has been sitting in you for 2 decades waiting for someone to ask it. The corn, he said. I remember the corn. The United States of America held nearly 400,000 German soldiers in captivity between 1942 and 1946. It fed them according to treaty and above treaty. It paid them for their labor. It housed them in facilities that, by the standards of wartime captivity anywhere on Earth, were extraordinary. It gave them ice cream. 375,000 German soldiers experienced that reality as a daily fact, not as an argument, not as a slogan, as calories. As fresh sweet corn in the Oklahoma summer, served to men who had called it animal feed and eaten it anyway because it was good and they were hungry, and the country that served it could apparently afford to serve it without limit. They carried that experience home. Not all of them. The ideologues carried their ideology, and some of them carried it to the end. But the majority, the conscripts, the draftees, the ordinary soldiers who had gone to war because the machinery of their country had required it, and who had fought because the alternative was worse, these men returned to Germany with something their officers had not intended them to acquire. They returned with a picture of America as it actually was, drawn from the inside, in the specific sensory language of food and labor and daily material experience. And when post-war West Germany began building the democratic institutions that, and partly because the American public broadly understood that the Geneva Convention's protections ran in both directions, American prisoners in German custody were a constant concern, and a war crime on the German end was a risk to be managed through compliance on the American end. Of the 375,000 men who passed through American camps, the number who ultimately settled in the United States after the war, who returned through immigration after repatriation, who came back to the country that had held them prisoner, has been estimated by researchers at between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. These men did not return because American ideology had converted them in classes or lectures. They returned because they had spent months or years experiencing American reality from the inside, and what they had experienced had given them a picture of this country that no official German characterization could override. Post-war sociological research conducted in West Germany during the 1950s examined the political attitudes of German veterans across different categories of wartime experience. Among the variables studied was where veterans had spent their captivity: American camps, Soviet camps, British camps, or no captivity at all. The findings were consistent with what American camp administrators had been observing in real time. Veterans who had spent time in American custody were, measured across multiple indicators, more supportive of democratic institutions, more engaged with the emerging West German democratic framework, and less likely to express nostalgia for National Socialism than veterans who had experienced other categories of captivity. The researchers were careful to identify multiple factors contributing to this pattern. The conditions of Soviet captivity were so brutal that their effect on survivors was different in kind from the effect of American custody. The specific reorientation programming that American camps provided had demonstrable influence. The exposure to American civilians through labor details had documented effects, but the food kept appearing in the accounts. In interview after interview, when former prisoners were asked to identify the moment when their understanding of America changed, when the country they had been told to expect diverged from the country they were actually experiencing, the food was the answer more often than any other single factor. Not the democracy lessons, not the camp newspapers, not the organized discussions about the future of Germany. The food. The daily, concrete, irrefutable fact of abundance, made real in calories and corn and strawberry ice cream in cardboard cups. Germany gave American prisoners starvation rations at Stalag Luft III. It worked Soviet prisoners to death in numbers that historians have documented with terrible precision. The contrast was not incidental or accidental. On the American side, it was the deliberate expression of a society that believed, under the full pressures of total war, with its own citizens rationing meat and rubber and gasoline, that how you treated the defeated reflected what the victor was, and that what you were mattered as much as whether you won. The Feldwebel from the would define it for the following decades. These men were present in the building. Their votes counted. Their memories counted. Their testimony to their children and their neighbours, in conversations around tables in a Germany rebuilding from rubble, about the country they had been prisoners of, about what it had been like to be there, about what it had fed them and how it had treated them. This testimony entered the record of what happened and what it meant. The corn was the beginning of that education. A small thing, a ridiculous thing, in a war full of consequential things. A thing that required no argument, no program, no ideology to accomplish. It just required sweetness, and men who were hungry enough and honest enough to recognize it. These stories cost something to live through. The least we can do is remember them. If this one meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next. A like helps more people find these videos, and the comments here have become something special. Veterans' descendants sharing what their families never talked about. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.